The day began for her much like it always did, in the quiet, pre-dawn darkness. Her uniform, a simple gray dress with a white apron, felt like a second skin. It was a skin that made her invisible. In the sprawling, opulent world of the Grand Astor Hotel, she was part of the background, a whisper of movement in the hallways. A ghost who polished the silver until it blinded and fluffed the pillows until they had no memory of a head resting upon them. Her name was Alara, but to the guests, she had no name. She was just housekeeping. She pushed her heavy cart, its wheels squeaking a soft, rhythmic complaint against the flawless marble floors. The sound was one of the few things in this hotel that felt real to her. Everything else was a performance. The lobby was a stage set, all gleaming surfaces and hushed tones. The air itself was different here, a carefully crafted blend of expensive flowers and something that just smelled like money. She moved through it, her worn sneakers a silent rebellion against the strict elegance of her surroundings. Her hands, though roughened by the chemicals she used and the endless linens she folded, were long and graceful. They were a pianist's hands. That's what her teacher had told her, years ago, in a life that felt like a dream she was slowly forgetting. "You have a gift, Alara," he used to say, his voice warm and encouraging. These hands were made to speak the language of music. Now, these hands spoke a different language. They spoke of bleach and disinfectant, of scrubbing stubborn stains and polishing endless rows of water glasses until they shone like captured stars. She would often find her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the surfaces she cleaned. A melody she couldn't forget would play in her head, and her fingers would follow along, dancing on the polished wood of a desk or gliding over the cool, smooth surface of a mirror. It was a secret ritual, a small way to keep the music alive inside her when the world outside was so silent. She was a musician Mank, a prodigy who had traded the concert hall for the linen closet, the center of her world, and the source of her quietest heartache was the grand piano in the lobby. It was a magnificent bending, black as a midnight sky and so polished it reflected the entire opulent room in its curved lid. It sat on a small raised platform like a king on its throne, bathed in the warm glow of a single spotlight. Every evening, a man in a tuxedo would sit on the velvet bench and play for the guests. His music was pleasant, safe, and forgettable. It was background music for cocktails and quiet conversations. For Alara, it was both a torture and a comfort. She would watch him sometimes from a distance, while pretending to arrange a vase of flowers or dust a pedestal she had already dusted 10 minutes ago. She would watch his fingers move across the keys, and a deep, painful longing would spread through her chest. It was a physical ache, a hunger for something she couldn't have. She knew with a certainty that chilled her that she could play that piano better. She could make it weep, she could make it sing, she could make it tell stories that would make even the richest, most distracted guest stop and listen. But she didn't. She just watched, and she remembered. She remembered the small, cramped apartment where she grew up, and the old, out-of-tune upright piano that took up most of the living room. She remembered her father, a man with calloused hands from his construction job, sitting beside her. He couldn't read a note of music, but he understood her. "Let it out, Alara," he would say when she was frustrated with a difficult passage. "Don't just play the notes. Play the feeling. That's the part they can't teach you." His belief in her had been a bright, steady light in her life. She had been so close. A scholarship to a prestigious conservatory in the city, professors who saw her potential, a future that glittered with possibility. But life, as it so often does, had other plans. Her father's health began to fail. The medical bills piled up, and the small savings her family had evaporated like morning mist. Her older brother was already working 2 jobs, and her mother was overwhelmed with caring for her father. There was no one else. So Alara had made a choice. She had packed her sheet music and her dreams into a cardboard box and left them under her bed. She had found a job at the Grand Astor, a place that promised a steady income and good benefits. It was the sensible, responsible thing to do. It was the right thing to do. But it didn't feel right. It felt like she was walking around with a piece of her soul missing. Every day was a lesson in contrast. She would clean a suite where a guest had left a diamond bracelet carelessly on the nightstand. a piece of jewelry worth more than her family's entire yearly income. She would overhear people on their phones, closing deals worth millions of dollars, complaining about things that seemed absurd to her. The caviar was too salty, the helicopter tour was delayed by fog. They lived in a different universe, a world where problems could be solved with money. Her problems couldn't. Her father's illness couldn't be bought away. Her lost future couldn't be refunded. Her daily interaction with the grand piano was the most poignant part of her routine. It was one of her assigned tasks to dust it every morning before the guests and the professional pianist arrived. She would approach it with a reverence that felt almost religious. She would use a special soft cloth, the one reserved only for the most delicate surfaces. Her heart would beat a little faster as she got closer. She would gently wipe the smooth, cool wood, her movements slow and careful. Then she would lift the lid and dust the keys themselves. The ivory felt cool and familiar under her fingertips, even through the cloth. She would run her cloth along the length of the keyboard, from the lowest, deepest bass note to the highest, clearest treble. And in her mind, she would hear them all. She would hear the chords she longed to play, the melodies that were trapped inside her. For those few minutes, she wasn't a maid. She was a caretaker, a guardian of a sleeping beauty. She would close the lid gently, her fingers lingering for just a second too long, and then she would walk away, pulling her cart behind her. The invisible girl with the music inside her, leaving the silent king on its throne, waiting for the evening and a musician who was only playing at being one. The clock on the lobby wall had just crept past 10 when the last of the laughter faded away. The grand gala, a whirlwind of sparkling dresses, clinking glasses, and loud, happy chatter, was finally over. The main ballroom was now a landscape of abandoned tables and half-empty champagne flutes, a ghost of the party that had just lived and died within its walls. The hotel's official musicians, a small orchestra and the lobby pianist, had packed up their instruments with practiced efficiency, their faces tired and neutral. They were performers and the show was over. Now the second act began. The quiet, invisible work of returning the hotel to its state of perfect, untouched readiness for the next 30 minutes. The housekeeping and event staff were on a mandatory break. It was a strange, limbo-like time. The energy of the party still hung in the air, a faint electric buzz, but the building itself was holding its breath, settling into a deep, echoing silence. The lobby, usually the heart of the hotel's constant motion, was unnervingly still. The only sounds were the distant hum of an ice machine and the soft scuff of a night security guard's shoes on the thick carpet. A few guests remained like islands in the vast, quiet space. They were the stragglers, the ones who had lingered just a little too long, lost in their own worlds. In a plush armchair near the large, unlit fireplace sat an elderly woman. Her back was ramrod straight, a relic of a different era of posture. She wore a fine silk shawl over an elegant dress, and on her lap rested a small, beaded handbag. Her hands, wrinkled and spotted with age, were clasped tightly around the bag's strap. She was waiting for her car, or so it seemed. But her eyes, a pale, watery blue, were not looking at the entrance. They were looking at the empty dance floor of the ballroom, a soft, faraway expression on her face. She was seeing something else entirely, perhaps a memory of her own youth, of a time when she was the one dancing in a beautiful dress, with a whole life stretched out before her. The silence in the lobby wasn't just empty for her. It was filled with echoes. Not far from her, sunk deep into a velvet sofa, was a man who looked like he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was in his late 50s maybe, with expensive-looking shoes and a watch that glinted even in the dim light. He was the kind of man who owned companies, the kind who made decisions that affected thousands of lives. But right now, he just looked tired. He was scrolling through his phone, his thumb moving mechanically, but his eyes were unfocused. He wasn't reading the emails or the stock reports. He was just staring at the glowing screen, a barrier between him and the world. He had spent the entire evening networking, smiling a tight, practiced smile, shaking hands, and saying all the right things. But now, in the quiet, the performance was over, and all that was left was a profound sense of loneliness. The hotel, for all its luxury, couldn't offer him what he really needed, a moment of genuine connection. A real conversation that wasn't about mergers or profit margins. He was a king in a castle of his own making. But the castle was empty. Across the lobby, another kind of silence was playing out. A young couple sat on opposite ends of a long love seat, a chasm of unspoken words between them. They couldn't have been older than 25. The woman was staring out the massive floor-to-ceiling window at the city lights, her reflection a pale, sad face in the glass. The man was looking down at his own hands, clenched into fists on his lap. Earlier in the evening they had been the picture of happiness, whispering to each other, laughing, their bodies leaning in close as if drawn by a magnetic force. Now that force had reversed. They were actively pushing each other away. The air around them was thick with everything they weren't saying. A fight had happened or was about to happen. A harsh word had been spoken or a painful truth had been revealed. They were trapped in the beautiful, silent lobby, but they were also trapped in their own private turmoil, unable to escape each other or the pain that hung between them. And then there was the piano. It sat in the center of it all, on its small raised platform, under the warm glow of a single spotlight. It was the main character in this silent play. The lid was open, revealing the gleaming black and white keys like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. It looked less like a piece of furniture and more like a sleeping beast full of untapped power and emotion. It had been played earlier, of course, by the hired pianist. The music had been pleasant, a gentle soundtrack for the evening's wealth and sophistication. But the piano held no memory of that music now. It was just wood and wire and ivory, waiting. It seemed to absorb the feelings of the room, the old woman's nostalgia, the CEO's loneliness, the young couple's heartbreak. It held them all in its silent, waiting strings. Down in the staff break room, the atmosphere was different. It was a small, windowless room, filled with the smell of burnt coffee and microwaved food. Ilara sat on a hard plastic chair, sipping a cup of lukewarm tea from a chipped mug. Around her, her colleagues were laughing and talking, letting off steam after a long, demanding night. But she felt a million miles away from them. She was thinking about the lobby. She was thinking about the piano. She had seen it on her way to the break room, shining under its spotlight, and the sight had sent a jolt through her. It was a familiar feeling, a mix of longing and a deep, painful ache. She knew every inch of that piano. She knew the tiny scratch near the pedal, a flaw only she seemed to notice. She knew the way the C-sharp just above middle C had a slightly brighter tone than the others. She knew it because she had dusted it every single day for 2 years. Her fingers aching to do more than just wipe away the dust. Her break was almost over. In a few minutes she would have to go back upstairs, to start the long process of cleaning the ballroom, of erasing all traces of the party. But as she sat there, a strange feeling began to grow inside her. It was a feeling of destiny, of a moment that was about to arrive. The lobby was so quiet, so full of unspoken emotion. It felt like a stage was set, not for a performance, but for something real. Something true? She finished her tea, the bitter taste a stark contrast to the sweet, powerful melody that was beginning to form in her mind. She stood up, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She didn't know what was going to happen, but she knew, with a certainty that scared her, that the silence in the lobby was not going to last for much longer. The sleeping beast was about to wake up. The lukewarm tea left a bitter taste in her mouth, a small, unpleasant reality in a world of artificial flavors. She placed the chipped mug in the designated bin, the sound a loud clatter in the small, stuffy room. Her colleagues were still lost in their conversations, their laughter a distant buzz. For her, the break was over. It was time to go back to work, to become invisible again. She pushed open the heavy door that led from the staff corridors into the main part of the hotel. Stepping from the world of concrete and fluorescent light into the realm of marble and shadow, the elevator ride up was silent. She watched the numbers light up one by one, each one bringing her closer to the lobby, closer to the piano. Her heart was starting to beat a little faster, a rhythmic tap against her ribs that had nothing to do with physical exertion. It was a feeling she got every time she neared it, a mix of excitement and a deep, painful yearning. But tonight it was different. Tonight the feeling was stronger, more urgent. It was like a string pulled taut inside her, vibrating with a tension that demanded to be released. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, expensive sigh. And there it was. The lobby. The silence hit her first. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a full one, heavy with the feelings of the few people who remained. She saw them, really saw them, not as obstacles to be worked around, but as individuals each trapped in their own quiet world. The old woman, a statue of beautiful sadness. The powerful man, an island of loneliness in his expensive suit. The young couple, separated by a gulf of unspoken pain. They were all so different, yet they were all bound by the same quiet ache. And then her eyes found the piano. It sat under its single spotlight, looking more magnificent than ever. The open lid was an invitation. The keys, a row of perfect white and black possibilities, seemed to glow with a light of their own. It was no longer just a piece of furniture she had to dust. It was a living, breathing thing, and it was calling her name. She felt a pull so strong it was almost physical, a magnetic force drawing her across the vast marble floor. Her feet, which knew the path to the ballroom so well, seemed to have a mind of their own. Instead of turning right, they kept going straight, towards the center of the lobby. Every step felt like a risk. A security guard could appear at any moment. A manager could round the corner. "What do you think you're doing?" A voice would say, and that would be it. The steady job, the income for her family's medical bills, all of it gone. The sensible part of her brain was screaming at her to stop, to turn back, to stick to the path. But her heart, a part of her that had been silent for so long, was screaming louder. As she got closer, a memory surfaced, so vivid it was as if she were living it again. She was a little girl, sitting on the worn wooden bench of their old upright piano. Her father's big, calloused hand was covering hers, guiding her fingers through a simple melody. "You're trying too hard," he had said, his voice gentle and low. "You're thinking about the notes. Don't think. Just feel. Let the music come out from right here." He had tapped her chest, right over her heart. "That's where the real music lives. They can take your house, they can take your job, but they can't take what's in here. That's yours, forever." The memory was a key turning in a lock she had forgotten was there. 2 years. For 2 years, she had locked that part of herself away. She had told herself it was for the best, that it was a sacrifice she had to make. But looking at the piano now, feeling the weight of the silence in the room, the sadness of the people around her, and the echo of her father's words in her heart, she realized something. Keeping the music locked away wasn't a sacrifice. It was a slow death. She was standing right beside the piano now. She could smell the faint, woody scent of the polish she used every morning. She could see the intricate patterns of the wood grain, the way the spotlight made the ivory keys look like they were carved from moonlight. Her hands were trembling. She glanced around. The old woman was still lost in her memories. The CAO was still staring at his phone. The young couple was still in their own separate worlds of pain. No one was paying her any attention. She was still invisible, and in that invisibility, she found a strange kind of courage. She took a deep breath, the air feeling thick and heavy in her lungs. Then she did it. She lifted her leg and swung it over the velvet bench, a movement so natural it felt like she had done it just yesterday. She sat down. The velvet was soft beneath her, a stark contrast to the hard plastic chairs in the break room. She felt a jolt, as if an electric current had passed through her. This was it. There was no going back. Her hands, the hands that scrubbed and polished and cleaned, hovered over the keys. They were rough and tired, but as they floated above the ivory, they looked graceful, purposeful. They remembered this. They remembered this better than anything. The guests, if they had even noticed her, would just see a hotel worker taking an unauthorized rest. They wouldn't understand. They couldn't understand that this wasn't a break. This was a homecoming, a single clear note hung in the air. It was a C-sharp, slightly sharp, a little hesitant, but it was pure. It cut through the lobby's thick silence like a knife, a clean, bright sound in a world of muffled emotions. The old woman's head turned slightly, a flicker of annoyance in her pale blue eyes at the unscheduled noise. The CEO glanced up from his phone, his brow furrowed in mild irritation. The young couple didn't move, lost too deeply in their own misery. For a moment, nothing happened. The world held its breath. And then, from her fingers, came another note. And another. She was no longer just a maid. She was a musician, and the music was finally free. That single, clear note hung in the air, a tiny spark in the vast darkness of the lobby. For a moment, it was just a sound, an interruption. The few people who heard it felt a flicker of annoyance, a brief break in their private thoughts. But then another note followed, and another. It was no longer a random sound. It was the beginning of a sentence, a whisper of a story. The young woman behind the keys, the one in the simple gray uniform, closed her eyes. And as she did, she disappeared. The hotel, the uniform, the worries, all of it melted away. There was only her and the piano and the music that was pouring out of her, a music she had been holding inside for 2 long years. The melody began with a deep, quiet sadness. It was not a loud, dramatic sorrow, but a gentle, persistent ache, like the memory of a loss that has become a part of you. The notes were slow and measured, falling like soft, cold rain on a window pane. It was the sound of loneliness. The man in the expensive suit, who had been scrolling through his phone out of pure habit, found his thumb freezing mid-swipe. He looked up, his eyes finally focusing on the source of the sound. The music was speaking a language he hadn't heard in years, a language of feeling. It was talking about the emptiness that can live inside a person, even when their life is full of success and money. It was the sound of the silence that follows a busy day, the silence that asks, was any of it real? Was any of it worth it? He slowly lowered his phone, placing it face down on the velvet sofa beside him. As if cutting off a connection to a world he no longer wanted to be a part of, the melody drifted over to the elderly woman, and it touched something deep inside her. The sad, gentle notes were no longer just music. They were the soundtrack to her memories. She saw herself as a young girl, dancing in her mother's kitchen. She saw the face of the boy she had loved and lost, a face she hadn't thought of in decades. The music was the feeling of time passing, of moments slipping away like sand through your fingers. It was the bittersweet beauty of a life fully lived, with all its joys and its inevitable heartbreaks. A single tear, clear and bright, escaped from her pale blue eye and traced a slow, gentle path down her wrinkled cheek. She didn't wipe it away. It was a welcome visitor, a testament to a love that was, in that moment, as real as it had been 50 years ago. For the young couple, the music was a mirror. It was the sound of their own unspoken fight, the painful silence that had grown between them. The melody captured the frustration, the misunderstanding, the fear of saying the wrong thing and pushing the other person away for good. The young woman, who had been staring out at the city lights, finally turned her head. The young man, who had been staring at his own hands, looked up. Their eyes met, and for the first time that evening, they were not looking at each other with anger or defensiveness. They were looking at each other with a shared sense of sadness. The music was giving voice to the pain they couldn't express themselves. It was telling them that it was okay to be hurt, it was okay to be scared. It was telling them that they were not alone in their feelings, but then something changed. A new note crept into the melody, a note that was a little brighter, a little stronger. It was like a single ray of sunlight breaking through a cloudy sky. The music began to shift. The deep, melancholic ache was still there, but now it was joined by something else. It was a thread of defiance, a spark of hope. The tempo began to pick up, just slightly, and the melody started to climb, reaching for something higher. It was the sound of a spirit that refused to be broken. It was the sound of resilience. This change in the music was reflected in the young woman's hands. They were no longer just playing the notes. They were dancing across the keys. Her fingers, which had been hesitant at first, were now confident and strong. She was pouring all of her own pain, all of her own sacrifices, all of her own unspoken hopes into the music. This was her story. It was the story of the dream she had given up, the family she was trying to support, the life she was living versus the life she wished she could have. And in telling her own story, she was telling everyone's story. The man in the expensive suit felt a lump form in his throat. The music was no longer just reminding him of his loneliness. It was challenging him to do something about it. It was a call to action, a reminder that life was not just about closing deals and making money. It was about connection, about finding something real. He looked at his hands, the hands that signed million-dollar contracts, and he felt a sudden, overwhelming desire to use them for something more, something meaningful. The young couple, listening to the rising melody, felt the anger and tension between them begin to dissolve. The music was showing them a way forward. It was telling them that even after a fight, even after hurtful words, there was still hope. There was still a chance to rebuild, to reconnect. The young man slowly slid closer to the young woman on the love seat. He didn't say anything. He just reached out his hand and she took it. Their fingers intertwined, a silent promise to try again, to listen, to not let the silence win. The music continued to build, growing louder and more complex. It was a storm of emotion, a whirlwind of sadness and hope, of pain and strength. It was the most beautiful, most honest sound any of them had ever heard. It was not technically perfect. There were a few missed notes, a few hesitations, but that only made it more real. It was not a performance. It was a confession. It was a soul laid bare, for all to see. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it started to quiet down. The storm of emotion passed, and the melody began to soften. The bright, hopeful notes became gentle, and the deep, melancholic notes returned. But they were different now. They were not just sad. They were peaceful. It was the sound of acceptance, of finding a way to live with the pain and the joy, side by side. She played a final chord, a complex harmony that contained both darkness and light. And then she let her fingers rest on the keys. The final note hung in the air, vibrating with an intensity that seemed to hold the entire world in its breath. And then there was silence. But it was not the same silence as before. It was not an empty silence. It was a full, heavy, sacred silence. No one clapped. To clap would have been to break the spell, to treat this moment of raw, honest beauty as just another performance. They just sat there in the quiet lobby, listening to the echo of the music in their own hearts, forever changed by the girl who played the piano. The final chord hung in the air, a shimmering wave of sound that slowly faded into a silence, so profound it felt like a presence in the room. It was a heavy, sacred silence, the kind that follows a moment of pure, unfiltered truth. No one moved. No one spoke. To clap would have been a violation, a crude attempt to capture something that was meant to be wild and free. The few guests in the lobby were no longer just guests. They were witnesses, and they were all bound together by the invisible threads of the music they had just shared. For the young woman at the piano, the silence was a jarring return to reality. The spell was broken. The trance that had carried her away, that had turned the lobby into a concert hall and her uniform into a forgotten memory, dissolved in an instant. Her eyes fluttered open, and she saw the world as it was, the gilded ceiling, the marble floor, the expensive furniture. She saw the faces of the people staring at her, not with annoyance, but with a look of stunned, tearful wonder. And then she looked down at herself. At the simple gray dress, the white apron, the worn sneakers peeking out from under the bench. A wave of hot, cold panic washed over her. What had she done? The music was gone. In its place was the terrifying reality of her actions. She was a housekeeping staff member. She had sat down at the hotel's most prized possession, without permission, and played her own heart out. The fear was immediate and overwhelming. She could lose her job. She could be escorted out of the building right now. Her family, her father's medical bills, the entire fragile structure of her life. It all came crashing down on her in a single terrible moment. Her face, which had been peaceful and transcendent just moments before, was now a mask of terror. She stood up so abruptly that the velvet bench scraped against the floor with a loud, ugly sound. She couldn't look at anyone. She couldn't bear to see their expressions change from wonder to confusion to anger. She mumbled a quiet, "I'm sorry," the words barely a whisper, and then she fled. She didn't run, but she walked as fast as she could, her head down, her shoulders hunched, trying to make herself small, invisible again. She disappeared into a staff-only corridor, swallowed by the shadows. Leaving behind only the echo of her music and the empty piano bench, the guests were left behind, floating in the wake of her sudden departure. The silence that followed was different now. It was filled with questions. Who was she? Where did she go? The spell wasn't broken, but it had changed. It was no longer a live performance. It was a memory, a beautiful, baffling secret they all shared. The elderly woman was the first to move. She slowly, carefully, used a handkerchief to dab the tears from her cheeks. Her eyes, no longer distant and watery, were clear and bright. She looked at the empty corridor where the girl had disappeared, a soft, knowing smile on her lips. She didn't need to know the girl's name. In a way, she had known her whole life. She had known the girl's dreams, her sacrifices, her quiet strength. The music had been a bridge across generations, a reminder that the human heart doesn't really change all that much. She felt a sense of peace settle over her, a feeling of gratitude for this unexpected, beautiful gift. She had come to the hotel feeling old and alone, and she was leaving with the feeling that she had just connected with a kindred spirit. The powerful man in the expensive suit remained on the sofa, but he was a different person. The phone, his constant companion, his shield against the world, lay face down beside him, forgotten. He was staring at his own hands, turning them over and over as if he had never seen them before. For years, these hands had been tools of power, instruments of negotiation and control. They had signed contracts and built an empire. But as he listened to the music, he realized they had forgotten how to do other things. They had forgotten how to hold a hand, how to build a sandcastle, how to play an instrument, how to connect with the world in a way that wasn't transactional. The music had peeled back a layer of his armor, revealing the lonely man underneath. He felt a deep, painful longing for something real, something that money couldn't buy. He thought of his own daughter, whom he hadn't spoken to in months, not really spoken to. He made a quiet decision right there in the silent lobby. He was going to call her. Not to talk about business or school, but just to talk. To listen. The music had given him back a piece of his own humanity. The young couple was perhaps the most transformed. The chasm between them on the love seat had vanished. They were now sitting close together, their shoulders touching, their hands still intertwined. The music had said everything they couldn't. It had given voice to their anger, their fear, and their deep, underlying love for each other. They looked at each other, really looked at each other, for the first time in a long time. The anger in their eyes had been replaced by a glistening sheen of tears, but they were tears of understanding, not of pain. The young man gently reached up with his free hand and wiped a tear from the young woman's cheek. She leaned into his touch, a silent apology and acceptance passing between them. They didn't need to have a big, dramatic fight resolution. The music had already done the hard work. It had reminded them that they were on the same side, that their shared love was bigger than their individual problems. They stood up together, a united front, and walked towards the elevator, not as two people in conflict, but as a couple ready to go home and heal. The lobby slowly began to stir back to life. A night manager, drawn by the strange silence, walked out, his face a picture of confusion. He saw the guests, all looking emotionally shaken, and the empty piano. He had no idea what had just happened, but he could feel that something important had been lost. The next day, the hotel was back to its normal rhythm. The lobby was filled with the cheerful, superficial sounds of new guests checking in. The piano was silent, its lid closed, waiting for the evening's professional pianist. And the girl was back at work, pushing her heavy cart, her uniform once again making her invisible. She moved through the hallways, her head down, her heart still pounding with a mixture of fear and a strange, exhilarating joy. She expected to be called into the manager's office at any moment, but the call never came. No one seemed to know who had played the piano. It was as if she had been a ghost, a beautiful, musical phantom who had appeared for a few minutes and then vanished. Later that afternoon, she had to clean the lobby. As she approached the piano, her heart beat a little faster. She lifted her soft cloth and began to dust the smooth, polished wood. It felt different this time. As she wiped the keys, she didn't just feel the longing for what she had lost. She felt the memory of what she had done. The music was no longer trapped inside her, a silent prisoner. It was out in the world. It had touched people. It had changed things, even if just for a few minutes. She had shared a piece of her soul, and the world had not rejected it. She closed the lid gently, her fingers lingering for just a second. She was still a hotel maid, and her life was still full of struggles. But she was no longer just a ghost carrying a silent melody. She was a musician. And that was a secret that no one could take away from her, a secret that she would carry with her, not as a burden, but as a quiet, powerful source of strength. A beautiful memory of the night the hotel staff took a break, and her piano solo left the rich guests in tears.